So, hi, and welcome back to Business Transition Roadmap, to our podcast. And I am so excited to welcome Kelly Robinson. She and I have known each other for many, many years. And recently, she left her partner position at what she would call big law and launched her own law firm. She's got over 30 years of practice in law, and about 16 years ago, she expanded her practice into family law. So did civil litigation and employment law prior to that and during that. And then about 16 years ago, launched and expanded into family law, which she now has that as her primary focus. And for those of you who are curious what family law encompasses, it encompasses so much. It encompasses divorce, custody, parenting disputes, pre and post-marital agreements, cohabitation agreements, which are interesting these days, and a variety of other things. So pretty much anything that you can think of around family, she helps with those kinds of issues, and also does some preventative type law in keeping people out of trouble. So when they're happy, some of the agreements get done so that if anything happens, there are some boundaries and some things that people can navigate. So Kelly, welcome. And I'm just so excited to have you here. You have such a great background. So how about if we start by you telling us a little bit about you and maybe a little bit about your why behind what you're doing today?
All right. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm honored to be here with you. This is fun. A little bit about me. As Elizabeth said, I've been practicing law for 30 years. I have a wide variety background. I have not done the same thing that I started out with, which is, could be unusual for lawyers. They tend to pick a type of law and stick with it. But I've been curious and like learning new things. So my career path has been more varied. I started, as you said, with civil litigation, doing, products liability, airplane crashes, Jeep crashes, those kind of things related to defects possibly in vehicles or airplanes and other type of devices like that. And then I did a lot of construction litigation and branched in eventually to employment law, representing mostly employers against claims of discrimination, wage and hour issues, negotiating management agreements. And so the whole gamut of employment law. Then I just discovered, although I said I would never, ever want to touch family law because my parents had a very difficult divorce when I was a teenager. I swore I would never do that. And then 16 years ago, I was working with a couple of colleagues who just seemed like they handled fascinating employment or family law cases. And I thought I shouldn't be so close-minded. And so I started doing family law and just ended up loving it, loving helping people who are navigating really difficult situations or sensitive situations and using my legal skills for them. And then, like I said, I never wanted to do family law. I also swore that I never wanted to have my own practice. And fast forward to about a month ago, and I decided I would, I didn't make the decision a month ago, but about a month ago, I launched my own firm, having decided to leave big law after being there for 16 years. And I am loving it so far. And I like to believe that, life can be in the transitions. So I think maybe I've learned that concept along the way and have welcomed this change and am excited about it. And it's going very well. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I am very excited that you did launch your practice. And yeah, I think that that's part of your next adventure. Yep. So it's amazing how, we all go through transitions all the time, whether it's through, one position to another or leaving big law and going into your own practice, all good things. And one of the reasons why I thought it would be great to have you on here is because we do a lot with family transition. And I know that private companies actually have family influences in them, even if there aren't family members working in the company. there's still, the business actually provides for those family members. And sometimes in divorces and other things, the business can get caught up in some of the turmoil at times that happens with those. And so for our listeners, I thought it would be great to have a little bit of a conversation about some of the things that you see in your work when you have businesses that are involved.
Yes, I would agree that it comes up all too frequently in family law cases, especially in the context of divorces, but also actually even in prenuptial agreements when you have young members of, the family getting married into families of, significant wealth, and they're wanting to make sure that, transitions don't get, sort of, I guess, complicated or, derail family planning because something happens down the road. And so, yeah, it really comes up in the family law context, both before somebody's married and unfortunately during a divorce, if there hasn't been proper planning for those kind of events and those kind of transitions.
Yeah. Maybe you could share with us a couple of, just a couple of typical things that you see, and maybe some things that have been done that actually work. So things that haven't worked for, just that you've seen, typical things that happen. And then also maybe a couple of other pathways or other solutions that might have been a better way to do it.
Really, one example that comes to mind all too frequently is when there's a business involved in the marriage. It was started during the marriage or significantly grew during the marriage. And you either have one party who significantly is the most responsible for that business, works in the business the most, or you can have a situation where both, parties were invested in the business with different roles. And then it's time for, unfortunately, the marriage to unravel, divorce, and the decision has to be made. What are we going to do with the business now? Who gets to, if both have been involved, who gets to take it over? Or if just one has been involved, that person continuing the business and they have to deal with, valuing that business. And that has, a lot of emotion tied to it. You can have a situation where the business, for the person keeping the business, they think it's valued too high, and the person who is not getting to take, go forward with the business thinks it's valued too low. And so that comes up all too often. And we also see situations where, you have a business that involves outside partners, and the family hasn't really addressed, transitions, whether it be in the event of a divorce and one of the partners is divorcing, and how is that partner who's divorcing buying the other partner or buying their spouse out, or can they? How do they get cash from the partnership in order to make that feasible? Or outside the context of the divorce, you being in business with your, partners and not talking about what's going to happen when we're ready to retire or we're ready to pass the baton on to the next generation. And now you might be the partner who's staying in it, and you have partners passing it on to their kids. And you're like, well, I don't really want to be in business with their kids, but the way our agreements are, I'm stuck with that. So everything's all well and good until it's not, right?
Right.
until you realize, oh man, we didn't really think this all the way through, or we didn't, properly plan for this event, And so it really can catch people, off guard. And, then on the flip side, you have the spouse who's not involved in the business saying, oh my gosh, had I known that this was a possibility, then I would have maybe pushed for things during the marriage to get taken care of differently to provide some additional protections. So, I think when things are going along and you don't want to rock the boat, or you don't even really think about it, life's fine. And then all of a sudden there's a monkey wrench thrown into it, and you have to say, oh my gosh, I wish we would have talked about these things and figured out how to transition better in these events.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I've found many, many times that so many business owners don't have a shareholder agreement, and they haven't discussed things. And even individuals, when you're an individual and you're the 100% owner, having a shareholder agreement could also be beneficial. I don't know. Sometimes it seems like it's not needed. However, we've got an example of an owner right now he's a single owner, right? 100% owner, thinking about bringing in 4 other successors. So thinking about doing that. And so that he can prepare for that, is preparing a shareholder agreement, basically one that he would like for himself. And then as he invites them in, they would be invited to either sign that agreement or not. And the agreement is really, the way that he wants it. So I found that owners, they tend not to want these agreements or not believe that they need them because it puts boundaries on them that they don't really want at times. And they feel kind of locked in.
Yeah.
I also, and you can tell me what you think about this, Kelly, in your honest opinion, but these agreements are for when things don't go well. They're kind of the last place to stop. It doesn't mean that you can't negotiate something different if everybody's still in agreement with doing it, slightly different than the shareholder agreement would state.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It generally should be, if things go south and we can't agree on anything, here's what's going to govern. And what's interesting is that what may make sense, when you're doing it or when they did it 20 years ago, and the reasons why they had certain agreements in their in their partnership agreement about sale, about value, about restrictions on transfers, things that might have made sense at the beginning of a partnership. Suddenly, once you're 20 years into it, it doesn't necessarily make sense. And how you need to think about addressing that before there's a real need to address it. Because at that point, whoever is really needing to address that obviously has lost leverage because they're the person needing the change, so to speak, right? So right. I think even if you do have a partnership agreement or a shareholder agreement, those should be revisited on a regular basis to make sure that those that are governed by it understand what it means and that they don't think, they don't see that circumstances may have changed where it doesn't make sense that it contained those provisions. So,
Right. And some of those circumstances could be kids growing up and potentially being interested, or what other things would make that, like what would trigger them to review it? Or what would you recommend? Is it just a timing, like every year or every 3 years?
I think if shareholders or partners who are, involved in a business venture together will at least, revisit it during their annual meeting each year. I mean, most of those years, it's going to be, we don't really need to talk about it. There's nothing to talk about here, but at least it's something that doesn't, when it is time, maybe it's every 5 years, suddenly you're like, oh, we haven't, it's on our agenda every year and we never talk about it. We really should now, right? I think it's probably something to just have as a placeholder. Are the agreements, do we have everything in there how we want it? Are we addressing how things get transferred? Are we addressing how the business gets valued in the event one of us needs to be bought out? Those type of things should, I think it's just because you should be having an annual meeting. You should be sort of a placeholder on that, even if you don't end up devoting a lot of time to it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that things do change. And one of the things also that changes is just the business itself. Mm-hmm. Finding that in the beginning, when everybody is building and growing the company and it's small, maybe not of a high value,
right,
then the share agreement's it's fairly straightforward to put together. As the company grows and gets more valuable and also just expands and maybe gets more complicated with more arms, mm-hmm. on it, then that agreement sometimes gets completely outdated and isn't even possible.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And then I think, the other issue I think we see people, they haven't addressed is that, let's just say, with your partners, you have this agreement that you're going to all stick in it. There's going to be severe restrictions on transfer or sale. And there has to be a meeting of the mind. You have to all unanimously agree if you're going to sell any of the assets and that all sounds fine and good until, you're getting closer to retirement. And then all of a sudden you don't have none of your children are necessarily interested in taking over your business. And then you're sitting there going, okay, so now what does this mean? You can't force somebody to come in and take it over. And so then what's going to happen upon, your death, if you're leaving this partnership piece into your estate, even if it's in trust to your heirs, who's going to manage that? Who's going to step in and be that partner role? Is it going to be now the trustee? And what does that do to, what you thought you were leaving your heirs? So I think there's always that piece about those who build a business and, hope that maybe, their next generation is going to want to continue it on. That's not always the case. I think you see that as well, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. We see that. And we also see that, there's sometimes an expectation that the kid or kids will come in, and sometimes it's just not the right thing for them. So they're just not as interested, engaged, and it's more of a burden than it is something that they love and, gives them wings and launches them.
Right.
Yeah.
Or then the other, the other thing you have is if more than one of the kids want to be the one that comes in and takes over.
That's right.
That's the flip side, right? Which one?
Yeah. How do we do that? Yeah. It's great. That makes me think of it's a client out of, there were 3 kids, dad who wanted out, 3 kids that wanted to be in. They were all active in the company. And the blessing for them was that all 3 of the kids got along, and they all really recognized each other's talents. So there was a lot of appreciation of the differences and working together instead of lack of appreciation for the differences and, creating that tension between them. So they were able to team together sometimes when you have multiple kids coming in, fairness, equality, and everybody wanting to be the CEO doesn't work.
Right.
Yep.
And it's especially complicated in the situation I started off with, which is if you have outside partners, let's just say there's 3 of you, and 2 of them have been the money people. One of them has been the worker bee, the brains versus the finances, or however you want to look at it. And then all of a sudden they're all getting, close to retirement age or beyond retirement age. And now you have the new generations coming in. And what if, the partner who's been the worker bee isn't, who's going to take over when the other 2 partners have been basically uninvolved in the business for the most part, rather than, pretty hands off. And there's no one to step in. And what if all 3 generations that are coming up, none of them have the appropriate expertise to manage this huge company that it's grown into? How do you, basically, if you don't address it as the business owner who's built this, how do you expect the next generation to navigate that when they don't even understand or have the skills to do so? Right. It can be a real mess.
Yeah, that's why I like the concept of transition being a journey, because, and in other podcasts, I've said this before, and it's in the book also, but foundationally, I believe why the statistics are so low that businesses thrive forward in the next generation is because the first generation or the prior generation leave too soon. They have this idea that they don't have to deal with it. and they actually, through osmosis, somehow that next generation will figure it out. And most of the time they try to figure it out if they can,
right?
Because it's an asset that, is functioning. But most of the time the business declines to their level of knowledge, the next generations, the successors' level of knowledge.
Right.
Yeah. And sometimes it's unrecoverable.
Yeah. Yep. Makes sense. And I think sometimes, in the divorce context, and you have a business that both spouses have built up, and it's going to be difficult for one or the other to take over, that can get very tricky. Either they have to come to an agreement, as to how are we going to continue to be business partners, even if we're not married, or if one of them's leaving, and giving up that control, how to make them comfortable with the fact that the other person's going to be able to continue to run it, or recognizing that they're going to have to bring somebody in to fill those skills, which is going to deplete, the money, cash flow available for any buyout, that kind of thing. So, I have navigated some divorces where the spouse is not, generally won't be involved, but it will be involved for a while, negotiating employment agreements to cover them in lieu of maintenance, that kind of thing. So you have to get creative, especially if parties going through a divorce, can't figure out how to, what to do with the business, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And the creativity, you start with relationships that are intact. Right. When you first start out. And the idea behind it is to figure out how to meet as many objectives of everyone involved as you go through the transition, and actually know which ones you're giving up. So if you're an owner and you want something, but the other person wants it too, or
right,
then I think it's great to be able to give the other person the gift versus having that feeling of it being taken from you. Well, that person got this and blah, blah, blah. Versus, gee, if you want that, how about we trade and I get this and you get that and you give me that. And, it's better in the negotiation. And right. I think it's difficult for partners or people to have great relationships in a transition where there's tension. It takes some real mindfulness to get through that.
Yeah. And in the normal business, context, that's one thing. And then you add the layer of a divorce and it's nearly impossible because you have all those emotions.
Right. All those emotions. Yeah. Tie in. It depends.
Yeah.
So Kelly, one thing that came to mind is in the beginning of a new venture, say you have some partners and you're going into this new venture, one of the things that I've seen in the share agreement is the ability to buy out a company at a very low value. And it's typically because the business is of a low value, so it kind of doesn't matter in the beginning. And the idea behind it is to make it easy for you to, buy out the other partner. If you end up in that scenario that you talked about before, where your kids aren't interested and you really want to cash out the value of it, but the share agreement is written so it's just book value or some low value. How often do you see that? And what would you do about that?
Well, unfortunately, we do see that, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. If the other members or partners are not willing to change that, that's the agreement you're stuck with. That's why it's hard when you haven't looked at this and considered it over the years as the business has grown, because you can't go into a court and just say, oh, this is no longer fair or this no longer makes sense. You're pretty much stuck with, it's a contract, and that's what's going to govern. Yeah. And the court is not here to, it's not there to help people out of bad business decisions, basically. It's
so curious, because, what would be your thoughts on the concept of when you begin your business in a share agreement, to put something in there about a market value, a fair market value. Start there instead of at the low value. And then if the business was unable to pay full value, or it was going to significantly impair the business to do that, because some businesses, the money is reinvested and reinvested and reinvested for so many years that it actually doesn't create enough cash flow. It's not built to get people out of the company. So my example of that is a company that we worked with. There were 5 sisters, all 20% owners, had been for years from their father. And all of them needed to transition at some point. So the strategy of how do you get them out, and started with just getting one sister out, just one, and building the business to get used to the payments so that one could get out and then another and then another. And I think now they have 3. The third one is just leaving now. It's taken years to do it, but at a fair market value. So my question to you is, starting with a shareholder agreement, do you start with that low value, or do you start with a fair value? And then if you need to, change the strategy, because then you're all in agreement and potentially keeping the business whole and healthy so it can pay the owner that's leaving.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it makes sense to set the agreements at the beginning as to be the fair value or fair market value, because that's going to be fair to everybody. And at the time, if, like you said, it gets valued at a price that makes it impossible for the business to fund a buyout, it's going to force them to come. It's a way to force people to come to an agreement about it, because absent that agreement, you're basically going to fold the company, right? So That's a better scenario, when you're basically forcing everybody come to an agreement or we all lose, versus starting an agreement with book value and then never being able to get anybody to change it, right? Because they get entrenched.
Right.
And they might be the type of people who are like, oh no, we're going to just keep continuing to pass this generation to generation, and with no one should ever want to get out of it. And it's like, well, yeah, it's fine for you to say that because you know who you're partners with. What about the next generation? All of a sudden they're partners with complete strangers, and things may not be going as smooth then, right?
Yeah. Kind of unlikely that it will be that smooth.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So gosh. Yeah. Well, Kelly, what kind of, in closing here, what would be one thing that you would recommend that business owners and our listeners think about or do when they're in business and considering potentially getting out?
I think my best advice to anybody in a business, whether they're trying to get out now or not, would just be to make sure you've thought through the what ifs. What if I got divorced? What if my partner got divorced? What if I were to pass away? What position would my estate be in and my heirs relative to this business? What would be the situation if my partner were to pass away and it went to their heirs? Where would that put me? And just think about all the what ifs that you may not want to think about, and make sure you understand what your current agreements would do with that situation and that you're comfortable with it. And if you're not, That's the time to come together and say, hey guys, have we all thought about this? And if we haven't, guys and gals, let's think about it now before one of us needs to be thinking about it, right?
Yeah, and that you're thinking about it as a collective group. Again,
exactly.
Concept of putting people first.
Exactly.
Because if you're collectively thinking about the entire group, you kind of have to look at yourself and go, gee, this might be hard for me to buy my partner out, right? Or to get that done. It also is going to be hard for them if I have to do that, but we don't want it to destroy the business, because the business is what's responsible for getting the money to either that partner who's leaving or the family. And all of those years of hard work and building and growing, you really want to, I think, harvest some of that.
Right.
Maybe not at the max value. If you're going to an internal type sale, which would be a partner, employee, family member. But definitely you want some good value for all the work that you put in. Yeah.
All
Well,
right.
gosh, Kelly. I sure appreciate you being here and sharing so openly with all of our listeners. And if you are interested or want to ask Kelly any questions, her information will follow the podcast. So her email and her new company, Kelly Robinson Law, is the new name of her company. And she's got so many years of great experience. You've done some amazing things for some people that I know and that we've worked with, and just really appreciate all of your openness today.
All right. Well, thank you, Elizabeth.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Have a good day.